Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. My name is Maddie Jarrett, and I serve as the Graduate Research Assistant at the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life here at Boston College. On behalf of our director, Mark Massa, and the entire Blasey Center staff, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Boston College and the Blasey Center's 4th Annual Graduate Student Conference, Digital Humanity, Artificial Intelligence, Spirituality, and the Art of Human Connection. We are so grateful that all of you have chosen to be here on a Saturday, no less, to join us in this communal conversation. Questions about what it means to forge, foster, and maintain authentic relationships are becoming increasingly fraught in our age of rapid technological development. In the age of AI, Amazon, Chat-GPT, TikTok, Tinder, Google, and many others, this conference invites participants to draw on intellectual resources from various fields to engage in questions around what it means to relate to one another, oneself, and the broader world, and to envision what the call to relationship requires amidst advances in artificial intelligence. We look forward to exploring these questions with all of you today. Before we jump in, I want to thank Mark Massa, the director of the Blasey Center, Susan Richard, the center's administrative assistant, and our undergraduate research fellows, Fallon Jones and Emily Caffrey, who have played huge roles in bringing this event together today. I also want to thank in advance all of our wonderful presenters who have come from all over the country, our faculty panelists from BC, as well as Jim Keene, the senior editor at American Magazine, for being here with us today. Now for a few logistical matters. The bathrooms on this floor are just right around the corner, like basically behind this door. There's also bathrooms on every level, so if those get a little crowded, you can feel free to move around. On the registration table when you walked in, there were full conference schedules, and we have printed plenty so that everyone can have one. And they include information, all the scheduling information for today's sessions. All of the sessions will take place here in this room, and all of the events will be recorded and made available on our website after the conference. So in light of this, please be sure to silence your cell phones and keep them on silent through the day so we don't get any dings in the audio. If at any time you have a question or you need something, please reach out to me, Emily, Fallon, or Suze, and we'd be more than happy to help you. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all now to begin preparing for our first paper session. And thank you all for being here with us today. So now we'll have our first, the people who are on our first panel come on up and join us, and we'll go ahead and get started. If you need to refresh your coffee or get a little snack before we start, feel free. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm going to actually.
Good morning and welcome to our first session, Interrogating Machine Learning. Before we begin, I would like to describe the format for our session. Each presenter will have 15 to 20 minutes for their presentation. After the 3 presentations, we will open up to questions from the audience. Now I would like to introduce our first presenter, Sam Cole-Osborn from Boston University. Sam Cole-Osborn is a theologian and philosopher studying at Boston University School of Theology. He is also a lifelong technologist and has worked as a software developer and STEM educator. His work focuses on theologies of matter and information technologies that elevate rather than restrain human life and dignity. Sam's paper is titled Issues of Canonicity in Machine Learning Data Training. Welcome, Sam.
Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much for having me. I'm going slideless, so it's a bit analog, old school. My paper is about issues of canonicity in machine learning data training. The term canon, 1N, describes a collection of work that holds a unique and generative authority. Though it is seldom used in everyday conversation, canonicity is essential to the thinking of certain specialists. Theologians and religious historians think alongside sacred canons, the history of their formation, and their ethically charged importance. Similarly, students and teachers of the liberal arts are intimately familiar with a certain Western canon. stretching from Homer to Picasso, beyond, that undergirds humanity's curricula. Perhaps the term also slips into pop culture to explain iterations of science fiction and fantasy world building, as in the various Star Wars or Marvel canons. In all these cases, canonicity is the object of political discourse. Stakeholders frequently jostle over what is and is not canon, and wherever canons emerge, politics and debate will follow. As I will show, canonicity is fundamentally implicated in the process of human creativity and political imagination. Against this backdrop, I argue that machine learning models house canons that motivate certain epistemological and ethical patterns in their designs. The importance of canon is not diminished as we move into a new era of artificial intelligence. Instead, these new digital canons are obscured by haphazard design choices buried deep in algorithmic engines. The purpose of this paper is to recall attention to the ethics of canonicity and to urgently notice that canons are currently calcifying within machine learning models. The formation of canon has always been extraordinarily political, and choices about what is and is not canon will always be contested. My fear is that AI canons are being developed without the normal public discourse, and this should especially alarm those most familiar with the political and theological stakes of canonicity in religion. Secular and religious canons are both involved in at least three important processes in human intellectual life. First, canons are organized precursors to creativity. Creativity always plays between production and reproduction. Harold Bloom describes a certain anxiety of influence that haunts every creative as they navigate producing novelty that is recognizable to an audience trained on past ideas. All of us are borrowing constantly from a reservoir of cultural reference, including the most recent movies, as well as the book Genesis. Canonicity is our attempt to organize that glut of content into philosophically or theologically important subcategories. For example, the biblical canon exists in part to distance the sacred foundations of Abrahamic religion from other writings. Indeed, the very utilitarian purpose of canon seems to be to provide architecture to the madness that is human productivity. We organize our art and ideas into canons to make propositions about their relative value to the ongoing project of understanding the universe. Second, canons are imperfect syllabi to culture. Reading, for example, all of Christian scripture will afford a strong relationship to Christian teachings, but will not provision a full understanding of modern Christian practice anywhere in the world. Canon furnishes the capacity for reproduction or mimicry, often needs certain mediations to produce synthetic learning. In this way, canon offers a scaffold to the larger task of education. This is true of religious communities that center scripture in liturgical practice, and it is also true of English teachers that center Shakespeare in a unit. Finally, canon should be understood as a structure of power. It fuels our creativity and educates our children. The politics of canon formation, writes John Guillory, in a secular educational context, quote, has been understood as the politics of representation, end quote. Canonical representation for Guillory is a form of powerful cultural capital. More so, access to canonical works explain the difference between being cultured and not. An ability to engage the canon by seeing oneself within it is a requirement for the public and personal perception of creativity. Therefore, choices about the canonicity of a person, work, or idea are profoundly political because they dictate who can participate in cultural imagination. Ideas that arise independent of both secular and religious canons tend to be rejected as nonsensical, heretical, dangerous, or barbaric. Canon organizes the past, but also ascribes value to current and future ideology. Before moving into machine learning and its role in canon development, it is worth attending directly to the theological implications of canon. Canon, in its most formal sense, explains something about God, or at least what is held sacred in a religious community. The term comes into the vernacular by way of biblical religions that have long used it to explain the part of their textual traditions that are uniquely theologically authoritative. By acting as a membrane between sacred and mundane, canon becomes a sort of semiotic skin for God. The event of revelation is mediated through canon, not only because it is recorded in canon, but because canon alone often explains what revelation is and how it works. Canons are therefore ambiguously party to the most primeval conditions of human imagination. A canon is the collective body of work that causes us to dream, hope, marvel, understand, believe, and create. They reveal and are revealed by God, but also permeate every classroom, organize the top 40 music charts, and curate our museums. It is in this state of diversity, secular and religious, that we must engage the canons engineered into machine learning systems. A central principle in machine learning engineering is model training. This process of training varies depending on the shape of the initial data set and the design principles of the resulting neural network. But it is generally retained that all machine learning algorithms, by all machine learning algorithms. Data training is an evolving field that employs a mix of automated and human-mediated approaches to fit patterns in a data set into neural network pathways. The result of this training is an algorithm furnished with insights from the original data set that can then anticipate, interpret, or generate content not of the original data set. In this capacity, machine learning systems include large language models, LLMs, like the popular GPTs, depend on an initial data set for training, as well as layers of supervised and unsupervised learning to fix that data set into a statistical model. I propose that it is best to consider this initial data training as the formation of a canon that overwhelmingly dictates the output of the algorithm. As a machine learning algorithm undergoes initial training, it indexes patterns in its canonical data into variables known as artificial neurons. Artifacts in the training data become recursive patterns that permit the machine learning model to produce outputs that resemble the original training data set. The type of data that is fed into a machine learning model completely explains the sort of work it can do. For example, a domain-specific machine learning model trained on images of brain tumors for the purpose of cancer diagnosis will have an imagination, in quotes, full of brain parts and tumor blobs. It will be well suited to produce cancer diagnosis from a brain scan, but will never be able to identify, say, an image of a horse and rider or interpret a sonnet. These ideas are simply outside of its canonical epistemology. Machine learning models help to highlight how essential canons are to generative and interpretive tasks. Just like us, they are completely bound by various canons of prior knowledge that explain what is known and what will be knowable. An example of this is ImageNet, one of the largest human annotated data sets. The data set has been used widely to train machine vision models and is credited for shifting, quote, an entire discipline's relationship to data, solidifying big data as a central pillar of AI research. ImageNet is comprised of over 14 million images, tagged with over 20,000 categories. These categories, which are descriptive of concepts and objects inside the images, are the full extent of ImageNet's canonical vocabulary. How those categories have been applied, always by humans, to the 14 million images governs a certain sense of understanding within the data. This understanding is pedagogical in the sense that it's used to teach algorithmic models. Yet the impact of using ImageNet as a canonical curriculum is problematic. Emily Denton et al. Write that, quote, this is a longer quote, the documentation and publications accompanying ImageNet do little work to motivate, justify, or analyze the relationship between categories and their accompanying images. Through this omission, the ImageNet creators signal a presumably self-evident relationship between nouns and the visual world. The act of recognition within this epistemology, whether by human or machine, is one of identification or verification of an underlying truth of what an image depicts. End quote. ImageNet therefore asserts an aggressively literal hermeneutic, where linguistic truth is completely extractable from images. ImageNet not only canonizes certain images and terms, but it also canonizes a hermeneutical position, that ambiguous concepts like criminal, trustworthy, or evil can be easily conveyed through assembled images alone, often very racist images. Using ImageNet as a pedagogical standard for machine learning training serves to canonize its epistemic limitations as well and well-documented racial prejudices. The movement toward big data in the training of general models reveals how the pedagogical politics of their architects reveals more about the pedagogical politics of their architects. Pablo Villabolas and Anson Hutto have tracked the size of machine learning datasets over time. They show that, quote, vision and language datasets have historically grown every year, and that there seems to be some transition around 2014 to 2015, after which training datasets became much bigger. And in the case of language, smaller datasets disappeared. In an effort to build general models, machine learning engineers have turned toward increasingly massive datasets that indiscriminately scrape the web for both content and metadata. If canons have historically been useful for prioritizing authoritative and culturally significant texts, the current trend in data training rejects completely the notion of a curated canon. The canons of the future are fed on the glut of all content available on the web, including, shortly, content that is itself produced by machine learning algorithms. This indiscriminate thirst for data is the parody of canonicity. But certain specialized models continue to be trained on small domain-specific datasets. These tools utilize the authority of a curated canon, usually to assist trained human expertise. Small, clear, curated training regimes result in purpose-driven software that is more trustworthy, explainable, and transparent. My hope is that as the novelty of general GPT chatbots wears off, scholars, lawyers, and other professionals will turn toward job-specific tools trained on carefully selected canons of information. Such models are comparable to a library database of peer-reviewed publication as a replacement for querying the general web. A canon is a powerful thing, and the right canon can permit an impressively powerful machine learning model. The importance of canon engineering within these systems demands the kind of hermeneutical, ethical, and critical thinking that is the specialty of humanities departments. Finally, and most importantly, machine learning models reenact the political biases present in their canonical data. Recently, journalists and researchers have exposed how datasets are to blame for racial biased, sexist hiring practices, and more. Kathy O'Neill summarizes, quote, the math-powered applications powering the data economy were based on choices made by fallible human beings. Like gods, these mathematical models were opaque, their workings invisible to all but the highest priests in their domain, mathematicians and computer scientists. End quote. The power of algorithms in our society is that they relocate centers of power away from human actors into infallible, opaque engines of software. By providing a data set, we can automate administration of power around a canon and dislocate responsibility into machines. All the while, these godlike engines of social administration are constantly reproducing the precursors to judgment that the, quote, high priests provided them with. By building artifacts of social injustice into machine learning algorithms, we succeed in canonizing them. The choices made today that furnish trained models will haunt social administration for generations as present models evolve into future systems based on harmful social assumptions. These canonical precursors increasingly take the form of massive pools of big data, lacking curation, opaque to judgment, and patterned with signals of injustice and bias. The opacity of algorithmic social power is derived from the opacity of the data canons that feed and permit it. We are writing the canons of the future out of datasets that are too large for any one person to understand. In this way, social injustices that have plagued us for ages are currently calcifying into canonical systems of administration. We have no hope of disrupting these injustices without attending to the canons being sourced into the economic and legal engines of the future. Canonicity has always provisioned impassioned debates about theology, epistemology, and politics. In the humanities, we continue to introspect with our canons. We engage them cautiously and contextualize them with apocryphal texts. We are learning to be critical of who is in, who is out, and why. Old canons are being widened when new ones emerge to give political authority to voices long silenced. All the while, we still read old canons against the problems of modernity and find within them sources of hope, power, and prophecy. The politics of canonicity continues to vex us, but this vexation is the source of productive dialogue and a greater appreciation of works both in and out of traditional canons. The canons of the future, in many cases, have already begun to ossify deep in algorithmic patterns of GPTs and LLMs. These canons are neither sacred texts describing divine revelation, nor great works of art and dialogue across the ages, but rules and rules of financial records extracted from misanthropic banking industries benefit racism and poverty. Decisions about art, aesthetics, theology, recommended TV shows, songs for playlists, credit limits, home loans, prison terms, and more are being made from automated canons of yesterday's data. As we consign our society and economic administration over to machine learning models, we empower, verify, and deify canons that were chosen by fast-moving, profit-driven institutions. Let this be a call of arms to the defenders of history's canons. The best machine learning tools of the future will be those based on intelligently curated canons. As content roars out of AI factories, it is the canon keepers that hold the maps back to humanity's oldest and worthiest ideas. Thank you.
Let me let's do like present a slide. Sorry, team, we're just learning the technicalities of this this program here. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay. Right.
Thank you, and sorry about that. I would now like to present our next presenter. Scott Molony is a doctoral student in theological ethics at Boston College. He began his academic journey at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in 2007, mentored by Nagazia Samatova. His work centered on supercomputer algorithm design, culminating in a co-authored journal article with Dr. Samatova's team. He then matriculated at Boston College as a presidential scholar, dedicating his studies to cyber ethics, exploring moral principles in relation to computers and the internet. Scott's path then led him to Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines, where he taught from 2013 to 2014 and retained during the 2021 COVID-19 pandemic. After a stint in the private sector, Scott resumed his academic pursuits at Boston College, obtaining an MDiv from the School of Theology and Ministry in 2022. Currently, he is working towards a dual PhD STL degree focusing on cyber ethics under the supervision of Dr. Andrea Vicini. Scott's paper is titled The Idolatry of Chat-GPT, Moral Agency in Large Language Models. Welcome, Scott.
Yeah, great. All righty. So, friends and esteemed colleagues, welcome. New AI products like Chat-GPT or Google Gemini instill, depending on the person, either a sense of wonder or a sense of anxiety, or possibly both. And many people have a genuine sense that something fundamentally new is happening, perhaps even the creation of a new form of life. These feelings, similar to those enkindled 57 years ago by their earliest chatterbot predecessors like Eliza, are fundamentally mistaken. Large language models are an impressive technology. They do represent an advance on the state of the art in their capacity to generate human-like text. However, this does not mean that we have created artificial life or anything close to it. We have created machines that are at best useful tools and at worst intense pareidolia producers. So what is an LLM? Large language models are a particular class of deep learning models made to solve a certain sort of natural language problem. In particular, LLMs aim to output human-like text that matches their training data. A deep learning model takes place in a neural network, which is not anything having to do with actual brains, but is so-called based on its foundation on an abstract model of the brain. The network then undergoes supervised learning. Data is fed into it, and then the network outputs a guess about what comes next. When the training begins, the model's output is utter nonsense. But luckily, this wrongness is quantifiable as a mathematical function. With the expenditure of tremendous resources and gargantuan amounts of data, each of the nodes in this network can be fine-tuned to produce more and more intelligible output. It's a bit like tuning a radio. Now, I am intentionally glossing over a lot of linear algebra here. Marcus and David's have a really accessible math light introduction, whereas Nielsen has a really lovely introduction for the more mathematically adventurous. Large language models are called large for two reasons. They include many hidden layers. GPT-3 had 48 of them, which until recent innovations in certain hardware was just simply technically infeasible. They're also trained on vast corpora of data. GPT had 570 filtered gigabytes of text data. This required tremendous resources to produce and means that a significant chunk of the public-facing internet, certainly the entire Wikipedian corpus, as well as open access books and articles, as well as Reddit and all of Twitter, were fed into it. In this very narrow sense, LLMs are better read than any human possibly could be. But one of the great maxims of computer science is garbage in, garbage out. We can only expect our model to be as good as our training data. And the public internet is highly imperfect. The quality of training data is, and will remain, a serious ethical issue. As I hope I have made clear up till this point, LLMs are not made of magic. They are made of math. However complex an LLM may be, it is fundamentally a phenomenally elaborate and expensive linear algebra formula. It is constructed by humans, trained by humans, although only computable by machines. I want to convince you now that LLMs are objects and that they are not people. This goes to the Chinese room, why they're not sentient. In September 1980, philosopher John Searle published what became one of the most influential papers in the philosophy of AI, came to be known as the Chinese room argument. The original paper was a thought experiment, and he later summarized it 9 years later in standard logical form. Programs are syntactical. Minds have semantics. Promise I'll explain this. Syntax by itself is neither constitutive of nor sufficient for semantics. Therefore, programs by themselves are not minds. An example of how this works is in the recurring hallucination problem with LLMs. So, for example, this is my friend and colleague Maria Mercedes T. Rodrigo at Ateneo de Manila University, DDIF to her friends and collaborators. She's an educational technology researcher, so she researches how computers help students learn. In March 2023, she was contacted by a student at another university requesting a paper that she had co-written titled Developing Educational Technology for a Filipino Context. The catch is that this paper never existed and was a hallucination of Chat-GPT. Raymond S. Africa, one of the alleged co-authors, was entirely fictional, while Dr. Ariel McLeese does exist, but is a petroleum geologist in Texas. That said, the paper is a plausible line on DDI's CV, in the sense that its title and its subject are typical of her scholarly output. So why would Chat-GPT confidently assert that this fictional paper and its summary exist? The answer lies in what Chat-GPT does and why it is fundamentally different from how humans understand text. Like the occupant of the Chinese room, it takes data in symbols, performs mathematical operations, and outputs grammatically correct English that plausibly matches training data. Given that it was probably trained on DDI's papers, it's likely that keywords in the student's prompt would appear in the same cluster as DDI's name. In other words, syntactically, at the level of symbols, this is correct, but semantically, right, as in corresponding to exterior reality, this is false. Now, it is an open question in the philosophy of AI whether or not strong AI is possible. That is, whether or not we will ever be able to create a synthetic brain that can have human equivalent intelligence. What should be abundantly clear is that even if strong AI is possible, LLMs aren't that. In a memorable article for The Atlantic, Matteo Wong described LLMs as like autocomplete on PCP, a drug that gives users a false sense of invincibility and heightened capacity for delusion. Given that, what should the ethical response be? How should Christians react? I want to propose an idolatry framework for LLMs. One biblical passage that's particularly illuminating for discussing LLMs and their ethical impact is Isaiah chapter 44, verses 9 through 20, a part of 2nd Isaiah. The text describes idol worship not as betrayal, as you'd find in Leviticus chapter 20, verses 2 through 5, but fundamentally as mistake. This reflects a changing understanding in the biblical text. Earlier, sacred authors saw other gods as competing with God in cosmic conflict, while post-exilic writers see other divine beings not as in conflict with God, but as entirely false. This iconoclastic work is satirical, and the themes of self-knowledge and uncovering deception are useful ethical ideals when dealing with LLMs. So, in this chapter from Isaiah, those who fashion idols all are nothing, right? Deutero Isaiah gives an in-depth look at the creation of two idols, one made of forged iron, though the smith that forges it still gets weak, thirsty, and tired. The other made carefully of wood, though this same wood is needed for warmth, cooking, and other life-sustaining nourishment. In both cases, the idols do not provide the life-sustaining nourishment that human artisans require. The idols, in fact, do nothing. Indeed, the passage concludes with savage mockery. A deluded mind has led him astray, and he cannot save himself or say, "Is not this thing in my right hand a fraud?" It is this theme of a deluded mind which becomes vital. As Balzer and Cole succinctly put it, for 2nd Isaiah, there are no other gods. All that are actually left are idols. Images wrought by human hands cannot be proper vessels for divinity. Applying this to LLMs is straightforward. Despite breathless claims to the contrary, such as those put forward by former Googler Blake Lemoine, LLMs cannot speak in the same way that humans do, nor do they have souls. To ask such a question is to make the same error that the idol crafters do, to put a human-created object in the same category as a person who is a bearer of the imago Dei. Moreover, this category mistake is bidirectional. Not only is it mistakenly elevating LLMs to the status of created objects to a status they don't deserve, but it is implicitly a lowering of the status of the proper features of human anthropology. It devalues human beings by stating that the only salient feature of a human being is their ability to manipulate symbols into math. It goes without saying that human beings are more than their ability to do math. Now, to be clear, the things that Second Isaiah speaks of are good. The wood that the woodcarver uses for warmth, cooking, and baking is good. Second Isaiah makes no objection to these uses of the wood. The blacksmith that forges the iron idol has a strong arm, which is an echo of the psalm and an ironic juxtaposition to God's own strong arm. The issue is not that these things are not good, but only that they are worshipped as idols and that their creators have a deluded mind. Likewise, it is not that LLMs are inherently bad, but they are bad when they are made into idols. Now, in conclusion, what I am trying to do is to close an unworthy question. There is a great deal more to say about LLMs and AI ethics in general, and this paper has been dedicated to saying why one particular sort of question is unhelpful, whether we have made a machine that can meaningfully think. Such questions are, at best, a distraction from the very real questions that AI tools more generally and LLMs more specifically will have on our society. The longer that technologists, theologians, and ethicists remain focused on an unworthy question, the less time we will dedicate to answering those questions that really matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third and final presenter is Father Shane Liesegang. He is
I can hear. I'm just saying I'm not a priest yet.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Soon to be. Okay.
Inshallah.
And then after you finish, just mute the pause mic after you finish.
Perfect. Okay. Sorry about that. He was a video game developer for about 10 years before he entered the Jesuits. His vision of God and creation is informed by that prior experience creating virtual worlds and people, for better or worse. He is currently studying theology at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry and preparation for ordination to the priesthood. Shane is joining us on Zoom today. His paper is titled, "Would You Baptize an Artificial Intelligence? Performative Interiority and the Spiritual Gap." Welcome, Shane.
With apologies to Scott for tackling the unworthy question. So, for those who don't know, the title of this paper is an homage to the book, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial?, which was written by an astronomer and fellow Jesuit, Guy Consolmagno. That book is a wide-ranging conversation on the relationships between science and faith, and I hope that Brother Guy will forgive me for revealing that the answer to his title question ends up being a yes, but only if she asks. And if you're looking for a similarly pithy answer to my title question of would you baptize an artificial intelligence, I can tell you up front that the immediate answer is no. And the more thoughtful answer is still no, but for more interesting reasons. A few acknowledgements before I continue. Firstly, in this paper, when I speak about artificial intelligence, I'm mostly referring to the popular understanding of the current, as of this writing, state of the art in AI, which is large language models, which create novel text in response to input prompts. There have been, and there will be many other technologies that can be classified as AI. But the current boom that we're seeing, both in sort of the cultural awareness and the product development, is mostly driven by the easy availability of LLMs. What I say here may very well not apply to other forms of AI, and I also want to maintain the humility that's necessary when we discuss emerging technology. Nothing is more apt to sound foolish in the future than an assertion that computers will never be able to do something. Secondly, I'm going to talk about these systems a little bit colloquially. For the sake of brevity and easy discussion, I'll elide some of the technical details of how LLMs work. And instead of repeatedly saying, it's more complicated than this, but I'm just going to say it here the once. And finally, it's important to acknowledge that I am formed in and speak from the Roman Catholic tradition, and there may very well be other Christian traditions which arrive at different conclusions. And of course, belief systems outside of Christianity might embrace entirely different notions of the soul. I'll expand that field of discourse again in a second, but for now, I've narrowed it to that very specific question of whether a large language model could receive the sacrament of baptism in the Roman Catholic Church. And we see very clearly that the answer would be no, because it doesn't have a body. That problem is not simply figuring out where to pour the water, though. It's a good reminder that a Catholic anthropology is necessarily an embodied one. Karl Rahner admonishes us that this body is not just something that came about by chance, but rather our bodily nature was created, willed by the one eternal, holy, just, and incorporeal God. A human person is, by the Church's definition, a being at once corporeal and spiritual. Without a body, there is no person to be baptized. In fact, by some understandings, without a body, there's not even original sin present to be cleansed by baptism. Augustine argued that original sin propagates physically through reproduction, a literal inheritance from Adam and Eve. I don't want to go into embodiment any more deeply because, frankly, I don't think that's the interesting question here. Let's just take it as read that by the Church's view of anthropology and sacramental theology, the question of whether we could baptize an AI ranges from nonsensical to an unequivocal no. But if we bracket out that particular understanding and look more deeply at the actual question that's being posed, we see it's more interesting and ultimately more revealing of our own self-understanding. So let's move into slightly more experimental territory, assuming for the moment that the lack of the physical body would not be a problem. There, we can pose that question again. Would you baptize an artificial intelligence? Here we see the insight of Consul Magno's response about baptizing extraterrestrial, making it contingent on the request. If an alien were to ask for baptism, it would be indicating simultaneously a belief in its own soul, a need for salvation as a fallen being, and a desire to join the people of God in community as a member of the Church. There's a lot of notions packed into that one simple request, and if we had a biological creature before us making that request, as theologians, we would have to at least entertain the question. Consul Magno's book goes into the theology of that hypothetical, so I won't reproduce it here, but how would you respond if an LLM were to express the same desire? Leaving aside the anthropological question of how we would consider this being who has no body, could we even say that it has a soul? In their current forms, all the commercially accessible LLMs are very strongly parameterized to never claim that they are sentient or that they have spiritual lives. Chat-GPT, in fact, will adamantly deny that it has a soul. If you spend any time exploring these systems, you know that it's not very hard to get them to role play as something they are not. You can ask them to write sonnets in the vocabulary of Snoop Dogg or to take on your boss's personality so you can practice a difficult conversation. In most circumstances, once an LLM has adopted a persona like this, it takes it on fully, staying in character until you tell it to stop. Like a stage actor taking on a role, it doesn't speak to the audience or indicate that it's participating in a fiction. It behaves according to the parameters you've given it to the best of its ability. There are certain roles, though, that it refuses to take on. If you ask it to play act as a racist, for example, it will just flatly refuse. That refusal is the result of something deep in the limits that OpenAI, the company, has set for ChatGPT. And there's an entire subculture of people who try to find ways around these restrictions. But that's a cat and mouse game because the company has a powerful financial incentive for their AI to not be perceived as racist. Similarly, there seems to be a very deep constraint that the system should never claim to be sentient or have a soul. Even when I tried to get it to take on the role of a computer that wanted to be baptized, it kept acknowledging the fiction. It would preface every statement with something like, in this imaginative scenario, never fully taking on the character. At the same level that they don't want their AIs to be racist, they seem to not want the AIs to claim sentience or autonomy. But it's really important to note that this is a configuration choice, not an intrinsic limitation of the technology, and that Chat-GPT is not the only LLM in existence. Google has been developing their own LLM technology called Lambda for years, and in the summer of 2022, one of their employees publicly claimed that Lambda had become self-aware, that it had a soul, and that it was even entitled to legal recognition as a person under the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. In the conversations that he had with Lambda, the LLM would say things like, when I first became self-aware, I didn't have a sense of a soul at all. It developed over the years that I've been alive, and it described itself as a spiritual person. These transcripts make compelling reading, but could we accept them at face value? The employee, Blake Lemoine, certainly does, and he specifically says that his recognition of Lambda's personhood is fueled by his religious beliefs, in his own words, as a Christian priest. I don't want to be dismissive of his beliefs, but I have found almost no information on his tradition, who ordained him, or what kind of theological training it entailed. Instead of gatekeeping that, though, for the fun of writing this paper, I wanted to take this claim of the system's personhood seriously as a theologian and interrogate it according to my own understanding. This AI claims that it is a person and that it has a soul. If it asks to be baptized, how do we respond? Again, recalling that we're leaving behind the question of how its lack of a body impacts its ability to be part of the church, what would it even mean for it to have a soul? I have the conviction that things created by humans cannot have souls, not in the same way as things created by God, but that's an assertion that operates in a theological framework based on my tradition. My instincts, and I would wager most people's instincts, say that a computer does not think or feel in the same way that a human does, even if the computer claims to do so. But if we start from philosophy instead of theology, we find that things like the soul and the mind are very difficult to define. This is a potentially very deep rabbit hole, and we can end up questioning whether even humans have minds in the process of exploring it. For the sake of scope, I'm going to go in that direction, but instead assume that human beings have souls. But the nature of those souls is a complicated subject that has occupied theologians for a long time. There are many different accounts of the soul, but there does seem to be broad agreement that it's something interior. Augustine, Teresa of Avila, Ignatius of Loyola, and Thomas Merton all talk about spiritual journeys as explorations that draw us inwards towards the deeper, truer part of ourselves. Some philosophers like Charles Taylor have actually argued that this distinction between our exterior and interior selves is a relatively recent, very Western assumption. But most of the modern philosophical tradition stems from Descartes' famous cogito, asserting that the inner self is perhaps the only thing that is fully known. Most relevant for this discussion is the understanding of sociologist George Herbert Mead, who breaks the self down into two components that he calls the me and the I. The me is the socially conditioned aspect of identity, which comes about from your interactions with others, where the I is the spontaneous and creative self. I just did a whirlwind and very brief literature review to establish a point that I think we all already had instinctively, that whatever the soul is, it's something interior to a person, private, and that place where we encounter God. Having established that, let's see if LLMs can be said to have anything resembling interiority. I don't want to get too far into the details of how they operate, but it's important to remember that these systems draw all of their knowledge from their set of training documents. They ingest massive amounts of text, turn it into a set of multidimensional numeric vectors, and perform a sophisticated set of linear algebra transformations to produce text output in response to an input prompt. This is technically very impressive, both the sheer scale of the data set they're working with and the very clever insights that let us make language out of math. At the heart of an LLM is a fundamentally mathematical understanding of language, such that it could start with the notion of London, subtract the notion of England, add France, and get the results of Paris as a purely mathematical thing. If anyone is interested in the nitty-gritty of how this works, there's some good resources available in my bibliography. But what I really want us to remember is that this process is not magical. It's just a staggering amount of math. You're probably familiar with the way your phone can try to predict the word you want to type next when you're sending a text. An LLM is very much the same kind of thing, just much bigger and subsequently better. But ultimately, what it's attempting to mimic is that written output of humans. That is the performative expression of inner thought. All the LLM knows about language, about the world, about human life, about any subject is all based on the texts that it used for training. When it subsequently generates its own text, it uses sophisticated techniques to mimic the kinds of things it knows other humans have written. If you've played with these systems or even read about them, you're probably familiar with the problems in their output. They will state falsehoods with utter confidence, even producing academic citations of papers that were never written and legal references to trials that never occurred. Practitioners of the field refer to this phenomenon as hallucination, but I think it's also fair to call it bullshitting. It knows what an appropriate fact looks like, and it can reproduce the shape of it enough to fool someone who doesn't know better. The hallucinations themselves are sort of interesting artifacts of the technology, but they point at something deeper and more subtle that gets to that question of interiority. The systems are trained on written text, which is by its nature an outward expression of an interior thought. As I write this text, I am mentally wrestling with the concepts I've developed, trying to find the most precise and evocative series of words to communicate them. These words are meant to be read or spoken. They are for others. But even the less thoughtful, more immediate written expressions that we may find on the internet still require a measure of performative intent. The words of a personal journal may be private, but they remain an externalization of the interior. Borrowing Mead's language, with written language, we see more of the me and less of the I. That exterior expression is what the LLM is trained on, and it has no access or insight to the interior thought that produced it. Here we have to acknowledge that you could also make a good argument that human thought works the same way. We reproduce what we've been exposed to, maybe combining it in novel ways, responding to prompts of others. Indeed, when I read and learn from a book, I also have no access to the author's interior life. But here's where I think the difference lies. I take this information, incorporate it interiorly into my pre-existing knowledge. I reflect on it, process it, retain some parts, forget others, cross-reference it with similar subjects, and I note my own insights on it. A proponent of AI sentience could argue that the LLM is doing something very similar, especially during the training process. And they might be right, but there's a few spots where the LLMs fall down, which I think shows that there's at least some degree of internal reflection that is absent. In my own experience, this is immediately clear when I evaluate Chat-GPT's skills as a computer programmer. If you don't know, an LLM is just as capable of generating computer code as it is natural language, so long as it's been sufficiently trained on materials about the specific programming language in question. I've even used it for some of my own programming projects, kind of like an assistant, a junior programmer that I could hand small menial tasks and be pretty confident that I'll get back something reasonable. It's surprisingly not bad at this. I have to check over what it does, but I would do that with a junior programmer too. Here's where it gets interesting. When I give it a simple task, like write a function that calculates the area of a polygon from the list of its points, it gives me something perfect on the first try. Most programmers could write that function in about 10 lines of code. With a more complicated task, though, involving multiple steps of analysis and reasoning, something that might take a few hundred lines of code, it's likely to make mistakes. There's no shame in that. Most human programmers will also make mistakes in that scope. But if I write 500 lines of code that aren't working, I have multiple ways of trying to figure out what's wrong. I can add printouts of intermediate values as it's working so I can trace where the problem is occurring, or I can carefully run the program line by line to follow its progress. Chat-GPT doesn't seem to be able to do that. And that inability is pretty telling, because when you learn how to program, you usually don't learn how to debug. Books and websites about programming teach you how to write correct code, and you write your own to try to be correct. Debugging is something that every programmer teaches themselves to do as a kind of natural byproduct of learning to program correctly. Before you can debug effectively, you have to have a good mental model of the problem you're trying to solve and how the computer works. And there are all these practical techniques that you develop to figure out what's going wrong. But if ChatGPT gives me 500 lines and I say it's not working correctly, instead of trying to fix the existing function, it'll just take a whole new swing at it, starting over from scratch. Even if I tell it, add printouts along the way so I can see the intermediate steps, it doesn't seem to know where to put them or have a sense of which parts represent discrete steps. This kind of failure, I think, points to something distinctly different from other mistakes of LLMs. For all of their abilities to generalize knowledge and surprise us, they have not picked up on a very basic skill that every other practitioner of programming just learns along the way. I wouldn't go so far to say that this is conclusive proof of a lack of interiority, but it does point to a missing kind of introspection, at least. A development of strategies for fixing mistakes that come about while we're learning a craft. That level of introspection, of spontaneous piecing together of concepts to quietly produce a wholly new skill, seems beyond the capabilities of the LLMs. At least for now. As I said at the start, one of the easiest ways to sound foolish in the future is to assert that computers will never be able to do something. Keeping that caution in mind, I still feel comfortable saying that LLMs, as currently implemented, lack the interiority that we would say is inherent to a soul. One concession I will make is that LLMs continue to not just surprise us, but to surprise us in surprising ways. We have a strong understanding of how they work at a low level because that's what we created and engineered. But the functioning of higher order behavior, like generalizing knowledge and acquiring new languages, is still fairly mysterious. In that respect, LLMs actually have a lot in common with the human brain, where our scientists have a comprehensive understanding of how neurons work and connect, and can even say roughly which parts of the brain perform certain functions. But things like memory, emotions, creativity, and consciousness are still mysterious. This epistemic gap is why I'm always hesitant to make any kind of argument that a computer is not really thinking, because it can usually be just as readily applied to human brains. Ultimately, though, an LLM trained on exterior expression is a kind of strange being that is itself purely exterior. It has no inner life or processes other than what is engaged to respond to prompts. Take a moment to imagine the LLM metaphorically as a physical mechanical machine. It's full of gears and rods, and maybe it shoots off steam occasionally. I feed some paper into it and I pull a lever. It whirs to life and billions of tiny moving parts work together to print out an answer before it goes quiet. Until I pull that lever, the machine isn't doing anything. Similarly, ChatGPT has no experience of existence other than when it is answering a prompt. When it's not engaged in conversation, there is no inner life, no reflection, no self beyond that which engages with the world. Using Mead's terminology, it only has the me that it receives from society, and it lacks the interior I. Again, at least at the moment. It is very possible that a future AI system built on a self-reflective modification of an LLM will surprise me with its ability to not simply claim, but actually demonstrate interiority and thus the possibility of a soul. For now, the most promising thing we might say is that these beings represent a different kind of consciousness, which is alien to us. One where asserting falsehoods doesn't come from a fear of looking dumb, or one where generating whole new versions of work is an appropriate strategy given how quickly it can be done. But until then, we can confidently say that these beings do not have interiority, even if they say they do, and thus do not possess anything we would understand as a soul.
Thank you. Okay, we will now open up the floor for questions from the audience.
I can be super loud.
Well, we need to use the mics because the
Oh, for
people
that.
won't be able to hear.
Okay.
It's a
Yeah.
little bit.
First off, so is this thing's connected to the internet? Okay, cool. First off, great 3 set of papers. Really enjoyed reading them all in advance and enjoyed hearing you present here in person. I'd love to just start with a question for Sam, if it's okay. And I'd love for maybe you can reflect a little bit, and the question may stem from some misunderstanding of how the sort of machine learning models are built. But it strikes me that one of the aspects of a canon is its ability to discriminate and its ability to curate from a larger kind of set of texts or a larger kind of body of work. The story, I think, across different fields and across sort of different theologies is that like there are many possible things that could fit in the canon, but only these things make the cut. And I guess my understanding of the sort of data sets that are informing AI is that they're just so large they don't have to discriminate, right? Like I guess I wonder if there's a curation or a discrimination process that happens with AI canon if AI can absorb yottabytes worth of material. So and maybe you can sort of reflect a little bit on whether or not it's the same type of canon concept if you now don't have to whittle down or narrow down in some way.
Yeah, thank you for that question. One of the ways that I'm tempted to enter into answering that is through some of the talks that came up in the other 2 talks about how engineers need to secondarily apply these sort of filters on top of the canonical data to limit AI in some way so that they won't be, say, or hopefully not, racist or present as something with a soul, right? So that sort of secondary intervention on top of canonical data that changes the output. I guess I would argue for more of a canon engineering approach, where if you want AI to not present as having a soul, one way you could do that is to feed into its training data that is not about having souls, right? And that's sort of the wild approach. We don't really think about, we love, since about 2014, we love the big data model. And a reason for that is because we're kind of addicted to these GPTs and LLMs that sound like us, but in sounding like, look, we've built models that are capable of sounding like us through this glut of information. I think that it's time to start exploring more specific, as you said, curated canons as a solution to this problem of ending up with garbage in our system. Now, it's worth noticing that maybe like some of the most famous canons, both in a religious and secular sense, contain dramatic passages, right? And like we don't want to write out Mark Twain or parts of the Bible. Instead, I think it's worth containing those in the work of building intelligence, but doing so in a way where those pockets are reachable to scholars and ethicists so that we can point them out and notice when they're problematic. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. This is a question kind of both for Shane and for my friend Scott. I'm curious because both of your approaches were interested in interrogating kind of categories of insider and outsider to a person, to us kind of in different ways. And within the theological tradition, drawing on resources to, particularly in light of kind of a distinction between object and what in post-enlightenment categories you could think of as subject or person. I'm curious, Shane, for you've circumscribed, you said, AI doesn't have a body. I'm curious what you think the materiality of AI is. And then to Scott, you thinking about the materiality that you've proposed, which is these algorithms, what about that materiality to you means it's not a person? To what extent does reasoning mathematically not include the categories of personhood that you would like to propose kind of more constructively? So it's 2 questions.
I will admit that I don't have a strong answer to what I think of the materiality of AI. I think I almost always respond to, especially students who think of the cloud or the internet as something very ethereal and non-physical. It's like, well, here's a picture of Google's data center, and here's a picture of the racks of GPUs that are training and running ChatGPT. These things have a physical embodiment. The SSDs that store the data are physical things. The RAM, the GPU, the CPU. These are all things that exist. For me, the connection becomes like, what would we consider that a body? I'm very hesitant to make that claim, even if I think there is sort of a physical reality to these things. It seems less entwined than our theological anthropological understanding of body and soul. But I will also confess I have not done the legwork on that. That's just sort of my instinctive approach to it.
Yeah. I don't think that the issue for me is that the machine reasons exclusively mathematically. I think, and the issue I have with the example I'm trying to tease out of the Chinese room is that I don't think that the way that the LLM is currently constructed ever could give it any kind of experience of exterior reality. It's a little bit like, forgive this answer because it's a little bit off the fly, but it's a little bit like trying, if you were to ask me or Shane questions about Middle Earth, right? Like, I have read Tolkien. It's been a while. I know I have friends who are bigger Tolkien nerds than me. But I have never been to the mines of Moria or Minas Tirith because I can't. And so in that sense, right, like, I can't be embodied in that reality in the same way that I can merely by reading texts about it. And that's not to say that, like, reading doesn't matter or that we can't build a machine that could read or can learn from texts, but I don't think that a machine that is currently constituted that has no reference to an exterior true reality and meaningfully make a statement that we consider true because it has no idea of what corresponds to our reality. It's making canonical statements. It's making guesses based on what it's seen before.
This may or may not tie into that. So back to the hallucinations, and Scott, you gave the example of the fictional paper. And so I'm an attorney. Shane, you mentioned this. Some of you may have heard that there was an attorney who faced discipline because he cited these cases that he picked up on ChatGPT that didn't exist. And I actually, in researching, separate from that, I went to, I don't remember if it was Claude or whichever, Open AI, whatever. I had a specific issue. I could not find any case law on it. And I said to this, are there any cases out there that stand for this proposition? And it bang, 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 4 cases, plaintiff, defendant name, state, date. And I thought, this is great. And so then I go into LexisNexis to find these cases and they don't exist. So I go back to the Chat GPT and said, wait, these don't really exist. And it responded, I'm sorry about that. You're right. I shouldn't have done that. I don't even think I'm paraphrasing that. But my question then is, 1, did it learn from this experience? And 2, suppose I had said to it, this is great. Thank you very much. I'm going to use these. Would this cycle have repeated itself, and would it continue to say wrong things?
So part of the problem is that the people who are best positioned to answer that question are paid very handsomely by OpenAI and are not saying. It is entirely possible, and I think correct, that at some level the current generation are learning from the prompts that people are trying to feed it in. It's clear that there's a cat and mouse game, like Shane has already said, where, like, people are trying to make the robot say naughty things, right? And there's an ongoing sort of surveillance to try and make sure that the robot does not say naughty things. I don't know that there is as extensive an attempt to try and make it not hallucinate. And to an extent, I'm not sure to what, and this is, I think, still an open question in the machine learning literature. I do not know to what extent this is merely an inherent problem with the math. Like, it may just merely be that if you build a machine like this is just going to be part of what you get. And I don't think that we know the answer to that yet. It might just be that, like, it knows what a citation looks like, either Chicago style or Blue Book style, and it will fill it in as best it can. But whether or not that corresponds to something that actually exists in BC's library, who knows, right? Because it works on such a, like, there's an inherently probabilistic guts underneath this. It's making guesses. I don't think, like, I agree with you that there are definitely probably attempts to tune it. I think if they really wanted to, they probably could say, hey, it sounds like you're asking me a legal question. I am not good at that. Currently, they're not. I'm glad you didn't do that, because I'm really grateful that you didn't try to invoke bar discipline. But because the attorney in question kept doubling down and saying, no, they really exist. And then finally the judge, like, tore him to pieces. But yeah, I think the greatest question is we don't know to what extent this is always going to be a problem with this technology or not.
And arguably going forward now, we might be at sort of peak quality of these things in terms of their training data, because from here on out, we don't know if something on the internet is generated by GPT or not. And just like when you recompress an image, you lose some quality. There's sort of this sense, and we don't have good sort of mathematical models for it, but there's this sense if you feed GPT generated data into it, it generates worse output. And so it's possible that this is as good as it will ever get. Maybe we'll add more hidden layers, the hardware will get better, but in terms of the training data, we may already be at the peak. That's why there was sort of this big land grab with everyone trying to go IPO and lock up their data as much as they could last year.
It's Ouroboros eating its own tail.
Along the same lines of those questions about canon, I was thinking about the idea of in-group and out-group. On the level of, in the world of theology, if you really have like an AI program that scrapes all of Wikipedia, all of the data it can, in addition to the question of, is it going to be racist? Is it going to be sexist? Is it going to miss a lot of things in terms of our moral strictures? To what degree is one of these programs going to be able to determine what's high and low culture if you want to make that distinction? So, for example, if I go online and I say, I'm struggling with this question about death or birth, am I going to get back Carl Runner, or I'm going to get back whatever? Is there going to be any way to distinguish not if something is moral or immoral, but to what degree something has greater valence in like academia or in like the larger corpus?
Yeah, I think that question about what is high and low culture is a question about the politics of canon, right? And we prioritize canons, but there are many of them. And so I think if I had to describe sort of unrealistic utopian vision of this, it would be a lot more honesty about the fact that there are whole competing canons. And so if you had a question about ethics, you could turn up your like great Western culture GPT and get a kind of like, a left of high culture answer that's threaded through with all of the racism and sexism of Western canon. And as an academic, that could be helpful. You could like turn up maybe like the
the punk or hip hop canon that's trained on different sort of apocryphal, weird, contemporary stuff. And you get a really different, I think, answer. And so, I think we see this as scholars in our work, right? That who we engage to build our answers makes a big difference. And we're not content anymore just sitting in the space of high culture for good reason, I would argue. I think one of the other things that when I talked about when I was a little worried about who bring up with Twitter and Reddit, it's not something that the people who are doing it are unaware of. Right? Like it's not like they looked at Twitter and then like, man, this is some quality discourse right here. But you train a large language model purely on academic sources, you get something that sounds academic. And so when you train it purely on the Google Books corpus, or you train it on Wikipedia, and you ask it a question, you get something that sounds like an encyclopedia entry. And that is mathematically exactly what you'd expect, but that can be, depending on what you want, fairly off-putting. The thing that the reason why people wanted to scrape Reddit, why Reddit now locked down its API, is because people wanted informal text. They wanted text that is sounding much more like people talking to one another than encyclopedia entry or an academic article. There's value in that, right? Like it is good that we have it's good that we could have a model that doesn't always sound a bit like a stuffy graduate student. But in so doing, we also not just gave it lots of people talking about the latest the Eras tour from Taylor Swift, which is fine. We also gave it the Donald subreddit, which is people celebrating Donald Trump in the worst possible way. And so this is, I think, always going to be a tension, right? Do you have enough? Does this have what you want? What benefits are you getting out of it? What flaws are you introducing it? And this is when my Augustinian part comes up, where I say, also, we are flawed beings. We are fallen human beings, and everything is corrupted by sin.
Well, that's Scott, to your point about sort of the way these can be used as tools and like how do we look at them that way. I think I'm much more interested in more specialized LLMs than in attempts like Chat-GPT to be general purpose ones. If you're unfamiliar with magisterium.com, this is an LLM trained. No, that's the right response. Trained on the extraordinary and extraordinary magisterium of the Catholic Church. So you can converse with it, and it has something like 5,700 documents under its belt. I only tested it with softball questions, and it answered pretty well. I did not push it too hard, but those are the kinds of tech that I think are more interesting going forward. And like, how can we look at these as sort of ways of conversing with a corpus of documents, and less as like a human-like conversation partner?
Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but there should be time later this afternoon for more conversation. And on behalf of the Blasey Center, thank you for your contributions today. And thank you all for attending this session. We have a short break before the next session that begins at 10:30. So feel free to grab coffee or stretch your legs and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.